Who do you think you're talking to? The voice sliced through the room like a blade. The group of high-powered executives froze, eyes turning toward the young man standing at the back of the room. James Thompson, dressed in a wrinkled suit, clenched his fists as he glared at the CEO who had just insulted him in front of the board. The tension was palpable. The CEO, with his polished demeanor and expensive watch, smirked. "I'm talking to the janitor." "Who else?" he sneered. But James didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady as he looked the CEO in the eye. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" The room fell silent, and for a split second, everyone knew something was about to change. James had always been the invisible one. He wasn't a CEO or a high-powered lawyer. He wasn't even a manager. He was the janitor, the guy no one bothered to notice. The ones who held the power in the room, the ones who made the decisions, would walk past him as if he didn't exist, murmuring about the weather or the stock market. Their words never meant anything to him. He was just here to clean up their mess. It wasn't that he didn't have dreams, he did. But they weren't meant for someone like him. He had always kept his head down, avoided attention, and played the role that had been assigned to him. But today felt different. The way they treated him today, mocking him without a second thought, was the last straw. He had worked in this building for years, and every day he endured their whispers and glances. But today, as he stood in the back of the room, feeling their eyes on him like he was nothing more than a shadow, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The room fell silent as the CEO, still with that smug smile, stared down at James. "I'm sorry, were you speaking? I thought the janitor was supposed to clean, not talk," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The group of executives chuckled softly, exchanging amused glances. The air felt thick with the sting of humiliation, as though the words had been a slap to the face. James stood there, his hands clenched by his sides, his breath steady despite the burning embarrassment creeping up his neck. The laughter continued, growing louder. A few of the junior staff looked nervously at each other, unsure whether to join in or stay quiet. The CEO, not satisfied with just the remark, turned to a nearby assistant and smirked. "You didn't think someone like him could ever have something worth saying, did you?" The words hung in the air, cruel and final. But as the laughter grew, a strange thing happened. James didn't break. He didn't shrink away like they expected. Instead, he stood tall, his face unreadable, and for a brief moment, the entire room went dead still. The tension in the room was unbearable. James could feel the eyes of every person in that room now focused on him, the mocking laughter still ringing in his ears. The CEO stepped closer, his tone condescending as he addressed James. "You think you belong here? You think you have something to offer?" The crowd fell into a hushed silence, waiting for James to respond. James could feel the pressure building, the weight of every word, every stare pushing down on him. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the room was closing in. The CEO's eyes glinted with arrogance, and he took another step forward, waiting for James to shrink, to back down. But James stood there, unmoving. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He had been pushed to the edge, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. "I can't believe I'm wasting my time with you," the CEO sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. The room seemed to shrink with each passing second. But still, James held his ground. The pressure, the humiliation, the ridicule, it all threatened to crush him, but something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let them win. Not today. The CEO's smile faded as he stared at James, his eyes narrowing. The room felt charged, everyone waiting for him to back down. James knew the moment he spoke, things would change. His lips parted, ready to say something, but then, he hesitated. The weight of the entire room pressing down on him, the challenge hanging in the air. For a split second, the silence was almost deafening. The CEO's gaze grew sharper, his impatience rising, but James stayed still, his eyes meeting the CEO's with an unspoken challenge. "Are you sure you want to do that?" James asked, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something unexpected. The CEO's confident posture faltered for a second, his hand freezing midair. The shift was subtle, but it was there. A moment of doubt. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. The CEO's eyes flickered for just a moment, his smug confidence starting to crack. James watched him carefully, noticing the way his hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation, and James could feel it, the shift. The people around the table, who had once mocked him, now seemed to be shifting in their seats, some glancing nervously at each other. They hadn't expected this. But James wasn't done yet. He took a slow breath, his voice calm, and even as he spoke again. "You think you've seen everything, don't you?" The CEO's face tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shot back, his voice defensive now, no longer the calm, authoritative tone he had used earlier. James didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, watching them all, waiting for the moment to land. He knew he had them. The tension in the room was palpable. They had underestimated him. And now, they were starting to realize their mistake. Slowly, a subtle smile began to form on James's lips, his eyes gleaming with a knowledge they had no idea he possessed. "You didn't really think you were the only one who could play the game, did you?" The CEO's face drained of color, and for the first time, he seemed unsure. His grip on the coffee cup tightened, and for just a split second, James saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. The others in the room exchanged uncertain glances. James wasn't just the janitor anymore. He wasn't who they thought he was. And that, for the first time, made them nervous. James took a step back, his eyes never leaving the CEO's. The room held its breath as the weight of the moment grew heavier. Slowly, James reached into his pocket, pulling out a small badge and placing it on the table. The room fell. Silent, every eye glued to the object. The CEO's face twitched, his arrogance slipping as he stared at the badge. You're with the board?" The CEO stammered, his voice losing its usual confidence. James didn't respond immediately. He just let the silence drag on. He could see the realization sinking in, the truth hitting them all at once. This wasn't some random janitor who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't just the guy who cleaned up their mess. James was a key player in the company, a decision maker, someone who held more power than they could have ever imagined. The CEO's expression shifted from disbelief to shock, his mouth opening and closing, searching for words that wouldn't come. James smiled, the truth finally revealed. The tables had turned, and now they were the ones caught off guard. The CEO stood frozen, his once confident demeanor shattered. The room had shifted, and the power was no longer in his hands. As James walked out, the murmurs of the room grew louder, but they were no longer aimed at him. The realization of their mistake was thick in the air. Karma had a way of working itself out. The man who had mocked him, belittled him, now stood there with nothing to say, his actions coming back to haunt him. James had been underestimated, but today he had shown them all that respect wasn't something you could demand, it was something you earned. And as he walked away, the silence in the room echoed louder than any words ever could.